Hi, welcome to Miss Linda's guided reading parent support group. I'm Linda Rumpf, reading tutor and parent support coach. So glad you're here. It's the day after Thanksgiving, and we're all recovering today, probably from carb overload and other types of imbibing. So today I want to recap the week because yesterday was Thanksgiving, as I said, and I was going to go live and I couldn't get up off the couch. So I canceled yesterday. So typically I will be live Monday through Friday in the group. But again, this week, this isn't part 5, even though it's Friday. This is part 4, but we're going to do a recap. And we're going to finish up the week today. So just to recap what we've been doing during the week, we've been talking about the basics of guided reading. And so we started with reading aloud, which means the child reads aloud to us. And then the second day we covered miscues. So that means that while the child is reading aloud, we're quietly writing down words that they miss, skip, or mispronounce. We try during the guided reading, during the reading aloud part, to be a good listener and to not keep interrupting the child. If they look up and ask us for help, then we can just speak a word that they're wondering how to pronounce, and then they can speak the word after us and just keep reading. We want that reading fluency. So the reading aloud part of guided reading is not necessarily the time where we spend, a lot of effort on sounding things out. We just want them to get in a flow. So, but we're writing down these miscues during that time. And then on the third day, we talked about taking that list and looking for patterns in the words that the reader misses and pulling out combinations of letters, or if it's silent E words that they keep missing, and or certain, like a vowel team like EA, if they're forgetting that EA says E, or that in a silent E word that vowel is usually going to be long before the E, things like that. We're going to keep a list of word families. I call them word families that the child needs to go over. And then we Google up our little lists of, 10 or so words from each word family. And we have the child look at that list with all these words, one after another, that have that pattern that they need to know. And they'll start pronouncing them correctly after like the second, third, fourth word, and they'll get the pattern. So it's super easy, super simple. Everything that I have done in the way I've designed my instruction here in the group for parents setting up their own guided reading sessions at home, I've tried to keep super simple. So obviously there are a lot of things I bring to the table as a trained reading interventionist and an experienced teacher, and now an online tutor for reading, that you won't have all my skill sets in your tool belt. But the idea is that while you're working with a tutor, you can cut the time in half that it's going to take your child to level up in reading by doing this home reading practice. And if you don't have a tutor on hand, this will get you started. So all that said, now I promised that at the end of the week, we would go over when you need to switch up your order of reading and then looking at words and word families, looking at miscues, and then breaking that out into word families. So I have some students who have what we call working memory issues. So, what that means is that the child learns things, but they don't necessarily retain them very easily. So, you will know if your child uh, has a weak working memory because you might teach them something and then the next time you read, they didn't even remember it. And then you teach it again. And then the next time you read, maybe they remember a little better, but they're still losing memory. So, working memory is our ability to take things that we've stored and bring them up in the moment to do a task. So, it's also known as short term memory. Um, but that's a really basic explanation because short term memory and long term memory are both called upon to do tasks in the moment. But when we're working with a struggling reader and we're giving them all kinds of new concepts, basically those are going into short-term memory storage. And then, later that week, when they're trying to recall what you taught them, it is still in short-term memory storage. So it's different than long-term memory, which has been worn in to the grooves over time. It's not as fully in because, you know, we haven't repeated it as much. Or for an adult, um, short term memory is very different from long term memory because um, things that you learned when your brain had more neuroplasticity, uh, you know, when your body was still growing, those things might be more embedded in the memory than things that you learn at the age of 57 or something like that. So, we all are going to have different issues with memory along the way. And then some of us aren't going to have any working memory issues at all. But then there also can arise the question of dyslexia. So, some struggling readers um, tend, and we notice this when we see them trying to sound out a word, they do letter switching. So if they're reading the word spell, they might start saying sl because they see the S at the beginning and the L at the end and they put those together. And so, they switch things around or they do things in different orders. We now know that so called dyslexia is actually a different skill set. Uh, they've discovered that some of the best computer programmers actually can do this activity very well of flipping things forward and back and up and down in their mind, and they do it without even thinking. This is what really makes reading more difficult for people who just naturally and unconsciously do flipping of images in their mind, side to side and up to down. And that's what has come to be called dyslexia. But, like many disabilities, we can also think of it as a super ability in another way. So, I really don't want to label or stigmatize people who do letter switching. And that's come right from the letter switchers themselves. They don't want to necessarily be called a dis anything, right? But it's good to notice if the letter switching is going on because it has been shown that these special readers benefit from what's called pre-teaching. So we have two categories now of readers, those who have a harder time accessing short-term memory and using it for tasks, and need more repetition, and those who do have these steps that their brain does in the way to actual reading in a line, like all the letter switching and flipping and stuff. Those two categories of students do better with pre-teaching. So what this means is that you as the listener have to do a little more work. So what I do when I teach those kind of readers is I look at the passage that I'm going to have them read during any given session, and I look at it ahead of time. So you're doing prep, but it is like gold, this prep, and it really works. So I'll look through the passage and I'm basically making a new vocabulary list for the week. So I'll take like maybe a chapter of a book that we're going to be reading. And I look for words that I think or I'm pretty sure they might miss or they might not know yet, words that seem a little unusual or longer words or words that aren't common vocabulary, anything I think that the child will need work on or the adult. And then I make my list and I have them write down the list. So they make a vocabulary list, they date it at the top. And it's we put dates on everything when I work with my students because it's really great to look back and be able to see, okay, a month ago, where was I? And look how far I've come. And so after they write, the date and the story, the book that we're reading, because that's important to keep track of too, and the chapter so that we can know what we've done. Then we have this vocabulary list that they write every word down, and then that's going to become their spelling test list at the end of the week. So if I have 2 sessions a week tutoring a student, usually what I'll do is I will have them study their vocabulary list words during the week, and we make flashcards as well. So when we're going over the words, ones that I think do not follow the rules or phonological patterns, like say the word sugar, S-U-G-A-R, there's no H after the S, but you have to say that S shh. So that it's not obvious. It's not really following phonological rules there. So we might make a flashcard for that. And these words are often called sight words, the ones that we have to learn that kind of step outside spelling, the typical spelling and phonics rules for reading. But there are methods by which you can see the logic in how almost every word in the English language is pronounced, and that based on what languages they originated from. So the whole study of like word roots and also word etymologies, where words come from, what language that they were adopted from into English, because English is a melting pot, just like the United States is a melting pot. And English started in Great Britain, which was originally a big melting pot as well, where all these different tribes and peoples from Europe, kind of coalesced there. So English has always been an additive language with parts from many different cultures in it. And so we can look at those, but right now, with a struggling reader or an early reader, we don't necessarily want to get into all that at the beginning. At the beginning, they just need to learn certain words, especially high frequency words. So, so that's why we make the flashcards. Flashcards are for memorizing things, right? So you're going to have your vocabulary list. You're going to make flashcards. You're going to have the child make, or the adult make flashcards for every word that you deem is not going to be phonological. And so they can work on their flashcards 2-3 times during the week. And that really helps with the memory as well. So basically, that's it. But when you do this prep and you make this list ahead of time and have the student write it down ahead of time and read through all these words, and then you help them with the pronunciations, you might look at word families, you put that part of the lesson first in the first half hour, say of an hour-long session, and then you go to the passage and read it. It is highly satisfying for students with low working memory or dyslexia, because they have those words right in their mind. You just looked at them and they read through the passage and they get those words, and it builds confidence like crazy. So that's really good too. However, aside from the confidence factor, what it does is it gives them an opportunity to correctly read everything without having to stop so much from the first read. And the reason this helps readers with specific reading issues is because, and a friend of mine loves to say this, it's not necessarily that practice makes perfect, but she always says practice perfect, or perfect practice makes perfect. So what that means is that if we repeat doing things the wrong way, it doesn't wear that groove the way we want it to wear in the brain, right? So if we're taking extra care to wear those memory pathways in through repetition, it's very good to have it be correct from the get-go with someone who struggles with that. Now, with a reader who doesn't have really any basic issues with memory, it will be okay if they sound something out wrong the first time, because after they hear it, then they'll immediately be repeating it correctly. And some readers will only need to hear something once, or once or twice. We're all different, we're all unique in our needs there. But that's the inverted method. Now, I said that I do hour-long lessons with a half hour of reading, half hour of teaching, whether it's reading, teaching, or teaching, reading. However, I don't expect that a parent will necessarily take an hour or ever take an hour at home just to do reading practice. So here's where it depends on whether you're working with a tutor or not. If this is a standalone program for you that you're setting up at home where you're the only teacher and you don't have a tutor's help, you want to make your lessons an hour long. And it will be good if you could have them 2 or 3 times a week. You will still want to do reading practice on the days that you don't have full hour-long lessons. So the reading practice is still going to follow all the steps, only you won't necessarily go on to the teaching part. You might just write down miscues and save them up while the reader's reading, you might write down their miscues and just kind of save those up for a day when you're giving a full lesson. So it's still very important to have them read aloud to you 20 to 30 minutes every day, even if there's no lesson that day. And that's part of the rhythm that I want to help people build up by supporting you to do that in this group. So that is pretty much it for the basic overview that I wanted to give you this week of how guided reading works. And so now I thought we would check into our book so we could get some words and have that experience again of the beauty of language that comes through reading aloud. And I said this in the videos earlier this week, but I think it bears repeating that what do we do when we're reading to ourselves and we come to a word we don't know? Well, for adults, sometimes we look that word up, but more often than not, especially with children, that word gets skipped. And you can learn a little about it from the context, but usually it just kind of goes by. So when we read aloud, we can't do that. That's another reason that reading aloud is very important. So this is All the Light We Cannot See. And I'm just going to bring you just a couple paragraphs again so we can look at some of these words that you find in a book that you just don't hear this vocabulary if you get all your stories from TV or movies. All right, so the next chapter is called Radio. And it goes a little bit like this. Werner is 8 years old and ferreting about in the refuse behind a storage shed when he discovers what looks like a large spool of thread. It consists of a wire-wrapped cylinder sandwiched between 2 discs of pine wood. 3 frayed electrical leads sprout from the top. One has a small earphone dangling from its end. Yuta, 6 years old, with a round face and a mashed cumulus of white hair, crouches beside her brother. What is that? I think, Werner says, feeling as though some cupboard in the sky has just opened. We just found a radio. Until now, he has seen radios only in glimpses. A big cabinet, wireless through the lace curtains of an official's house, a portable unit in a miner's dormitory, another in the church refectory. He has never touched one. He and Yuta smuggle the device back to Victoria Strasse 3 and appraise it beneath an electric lamp. They wipe it clean, untangle the snarl of wires, wash mud out of the earphone. Okay, so this is important to later in the story that Werner is going to start learning about radios. It turns out he's a genius with radios. And that plays a big part in what he does during the war and how he and Marie Laura, our first character that we found out about earlier in the week, who lives in France, how they come together. Basically, Marie Laura's family is part of the French Resistance, and they have a radio, and they have this kind of big fancy radio. Her uncle had this whole setup, and he used to broadcast facts for children. And Werner, all the way over in a different world in Germany as he was growing up, after he discovers this radio, he finds the professor, Maria Laura's uncle, broadcasting on the radio these facts for children. And Werner's growing up in a Germany that will become Nazi Germany, where they will be told what to think. And later he even goes to this camp for youth where they're indoctrinated. And all the things that he heard the professor say on the radio, every night the professor had a radio show and he talked about science basically. All the things that Warner heard, and Maria Laura listens to it too when she's a little girl, were facts, and they were bits of truth that Warner could hang on to when he grew up later and was forced to become a Nazi youth and, receive all this propaganda, which wasn't true. So his sister says to him at one point, keep the frequency. And what she means is keep your inner heart for truth. And so the radio is important in the story because it brings them together across cultures, across being on two separate sides in a war. It brings Warner and Maria Laura together in the book because they both used to listen to the professor, and radios were a way for the French during the resistance to cheer on the people. And they weren't allowed to have radios in the town in which Maria Laura lived because they were occupied by the Germans at the time. And so they weren't allowed to broadcast. So she was doing it secretly and illegally, and she could have gotten killed for it. The penalty was death for broadcasting. But every night she would go on and she would read from this book in Braille because she's blind. A book that her father bought her when she was little, and it's a Braille copy of 1,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and there are all these interesting like factoids in that book about deep sea creatures and how do they have light, how do they make light, even though there's absolutely zero light down in the bottom of the ocean, and yet they make light out of chemicals in their body. And so all this wraps into the title of the book too, All the Light We Cannot See, because she's blind, but there's this kind of light that sea creatures make, even though there's no light, no real light around them. And there's also light that we bring to other people when we inspire them, when we reach out across the airwaves to give them support. And I just like thinking that through these lives, I can be a little bit like that, like helping support you in an activity that might have brought you frustration before, helping a struggling reader to read, an activity that you might have no idea how to embrace, an activity you may have given up on. I feel like, that this ability to live stream and talk to you about how to go about step by step making this reading happen and fixing this issue is kind of like bringing light into a dark place. So that was why I started off my first week of my weekday daily show with this book, All the Light You Cannot See. And we're going to do it. I do it all the time. I get struggling readers with dyslexia, with working memory issues, with all kinds of issues. I get them up to grade level, and it's amazing. So we just have to do the steps, and I'm going to help you. So Deidre, my assistant, has been running banners underneath this video. And I just want to call attention to that as well, that there's a workbook that I've created to help you with setting up your home reading program and or your home reading practice if you're working with a tutor, and you want to help reduce the time that it takes for your child to level up in grade levels with their reading. So the workbook will keep you organized. It explains all the parts of the guided reading lesson and some extra cool stuff like pronunciation marks that I use. And it has an organizational part at the end with spaces for all your lists. There are all these lists you have to keep organized: the spelling list and the the miscue list and the word family list. And so it's really great. It'll help you so much. And you can just email Deidre at deidre.readingrevolution@gmail.com and get the workbook totally free from me to you. And I'm so glad that you tuned in today. See you next week.